An interesting development in the media world where some prominent conservative voices are opposing President Donald Trump's stance on the Ukraine-Russia war.
Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator this week, in part because he hasn't held any elections.
Trump also said that Zelenskyy had started the war. Here's political commentator Mark Levin on his radio show this week.
Zelenskyy ordered martial law. That's what the Constitution there compelled. Zelenskyy hasn't called for an election. That's what the Constitution there compels. Now, I'm waiting for the first free election for Vladimir Putin. I mean, this is almost comical in a sick way that Putin is demanding an election. Why is he demanding an election in Ukraine when he doesn't have free and real elections in his own country? And why does he get to call the shots when, in fact, he murders people who dare to challenge him? They didn't start this war. What were they supposed to do, roll over and play dead? 81% of the American people do not trust Putin because 81% of the American people are smart.
Fox host Brian Kilmeade and Senate Majority Leader John Thune also weighed in.
I believe that the Ukraine are the good guys in this. If they had their druthers, they would just be a westernized nation prospering the best they can with an imperfect democracy. It's Russia that is the problem. But what do you do with people in your own party that said, I'm done with this?
Well, I mean, I think there's that strong sentiment out there, and of course I hear it, and I think that, frankly, I don't think there's any question about this. Putin and Russia are very clearly the aggressor in this conflict. That's just a fact.
Then, also as part of this trend, Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo and Republican Congressman Rich McCormick had a chat during her show this week. They voiced their thoughts on a potential Trump and Musk plan to give taxpayers dividends from DOGE savings. Here they are.
I'm not real big on sending money back to the people in the form of checks. I'd much rather see the debt paid down because, quite frankly, when you send it back to the people, we're still building up a huge amount of debt, which we pay interest on. $1 trillion in debt interest payments per year. That's more than we spend on the military. We need to fix that.
Yeah, no, and we were just talking about this, Mark. I mean, to give money back to voters, it sounds nice and everything, but if our worry is debt and deficits, just send the money toward the debt and deficits. Let's clean things up.
Former Vice President Mike Pence and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley had also slammed Trump over his Zelenskyy comments this week.
Independent journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote on X, "It's so dumb when establishment liberals feign shock that they agree with Mike Pence over something like Ukraine. The establishment wings of both parties agree on most foreign policy questions. Ukraine, China, Israel, NATO, etc. That's why the Cheneys campaigned for Kamala. The New York Post's cover today has a Ukrainian flag on the top corner." Federalist co-founder Sean Davis wrote on X, "So I guess the New York Post is doing the stupid Ukraine flag thing again. Kind of weird that we get this nonsense back the very moment the intellectual dork web neocons are all trying to gatekeep everyone to their right to keep the war going."
Lovely stuff. Dork web neocons is a phrase that we need more of, I think.
The Ukraine flags. It's like we were in Alexandria.
Yeah.
You drive through Alexandria and it's just more Ukraine flags than U.S.
Little Kyiv over in Alexandria, over in northern Virginia. So look, I mean, we could get into the whole debate over the Ukraine war itself, but what I find more interesting about this story is these conservative commentators, very fervently conservative in some cases, displaying a willingness to be really quite critical of the Trump position. I mean, certainly Mark Levin there was really taking a very thinly veiled jab at some of the comments Trump had made. I mean, Levin noted that Zelensky's approval ratings were about 57% as opposed to the 4% that Trump had mentioned, but also making this argument, what were the Ukrainians supposed to do whenever Russia invaded? So there's a lot there.
There's definitely an old guard, new guard thing going on here in conservative media. On the old guard side, you certainly have Mark Levin, you have Glenn Beck, and I wonder where Rush Limbaugh would have fallen on this particular conflict. But Mark Levin represents that, I hate the communists of Russia perspective, which is we don't like Putin and the Russians. Not very surprising at all. And these are foreign policy conservatives who still stand by things like the war in Iraq, the Afghanistan invasion, and the war on terror. So that split exists. But what we're seeing here is the Tucker Carlson wing of the sort of new Republican and conservative movement versus, I would say, Ben Shapiro over at the Daily Wire, who's also one of the biggest voices, and he represents exactly what Mark Levin said as well, which is Putin is a thug. The Russian state is evil. They kill their dissidents without any discrimination, and Ukraine is doing exactly what they should do. But the line is drawn over how far the U.S. needs to go in support of Ukraine in getting every inch of their territory back. And I think Ben Shapiro has articulated this very well in saying the problem has been that we should support Ukraine, but also broker an agreement that ends this war, and Russia's going to keep that eastern flank of the country because you can't get it back unless you give them jets and heavier armor.
Well, that may be the case, but I notice in Levin's comments, for example, he talks about Putin quite a lot in a way that is certainly implicitly critical of the Trump position, saying, for example, why does he, this is Putin, get to call the shots? Or that he, Levin, is still waiting for the first free election from Vladimir Putin. That is pretty clearly not Trump's position, because Trump has not really blamed Putin very much at all for having invaded a neighboring country. So I just think it's interesting because even though I completely take the point that there is this split in foreign policy terms, Levin, at least this time around, had endorsed Trump from very early on, I think early 2023, and is a generally very Trump supportive voice, as is Brian Kilmeade, for what it's worth, on Fox News Radio. So I find the willingness of these people to express their dissent interesting in itself.
I've operated in conservative and libertarian media my entire career. I don't find it surprising. There is a lot of diversity of thought on a lot of these issues, and there was a clip in there about DOGE and check payments as well. You know, this is, again, a thing where populists and true conservatives vocally disagree on what is good policy, and they will call it out. The Republican Party is rambunctious. I know the Democrats have their own party, they have their own factions that like to make a lot of noise, but I don't think that's ever been comparative to the level of dysfunction and disagreement you see in a big tent party like the Republicans.
But isn't that in a sense blurring the line between the Republican Party and the conservative mainstream media, by which I'm primarily talking about
Donald
Fox
Trump
News.
famously said, I'm not running to be the conservative nominee, I'm running to be the Republican nominee. He's not very conservative.
Right, exactly. And so there is all of those disputes within the more, I would say, intellectual.
You know, the Tucker Carlson line throughout this entire conflict has been to call Zelenskyy a dictator, which Mark Levin points out in his response here. Well, yeah, there are no elections during wartime. Their constitution allows for that. And just like history nerding here, you know, going back to the very earliest origins of the role of dictator in the Roman Empire, the idea, or actually republic, the idea was when the barbarians are at the gates, when invaders are at the borders of Rome, you dispense with democracy and you have one singular leader who finishes that war. Ukraine was invaded by a hostile power to the east. And you suspend elections and have that person ride out the war to its completion. The problem is nobody is trying to complete it. And the U.S. policy has been to elongate this war without giving Ukraine what it actually needs to be successful. That's got to stop.
I mean, I don't massively disagree with that point. I think myself and Robbie were talking about this yesterday. He's very opposed to the U.S. expenditure in the war. My point is there is a difficult choice either way. Either you cede the ground and let Putin win a war of aggression with all the dangers that come with that in terms of Putin's role, in terms of America's prestige and influence, or you don't do that and you keep sending the money in the hope that attrition will work, and that's a long process.
It is, and nobody wants to reward Putin for hostile actions. Right. But we have to pick a position here, which is how much are we actually willing to put on the line to end this? I think Donald Trump is employing the strategy here, and I'm gonna call it a strategy of being the bad guy in this situation and saying, Zelenskyy, go back to your people and blame me.
But
he's not
being the bad guy to Putin,
no, but to Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy needs an out. He needs the U.S. president, because they are practically a client state of the U.S., to say the U.S. president will no longer support us. We're going to have to take these losses on the eastern region of Ukraine. We have no other option. That gives Zelenskyy cover that he didn't have before. And Donald Trump, I think, is doing that in his own special, twisted way.
I think that is a generous interpretation, but we will, I'm sure, return to that topic on some other time. On to the topic of diversity. Is that a problem for the Democrats? How are they messaging it? More on that coming up now.